but we didn't have one. This was long before they did that. Sent you to ground school, and then you got cockpit time, and you knew how to fire it up. And time come to do my checkout, why some officer climbed up on the wing and from the operations office and had me put my hand over my eyes and point out the various instruments and controls and said, okay, you're ready to go. And the crew chief plugged in a portable gasoline power unit to start the engine with, and gave me the signal to wind it up. And so I turned it on and wound it up, and it wouldn't get the turbine wouldn't turn over fast enough to start it. I put the fuel in, but it didn't fire up, and they referred to that as not getting it over the hump. In other words, getting it RPM high enough so the engine would actually start. And so shut it down, and he unplugged the power generator, and boy, he was somewhat unhappy. He went around to the nose of that airplane, and he was a hefty guy and fairly good size, and he put the nose of the airplane on his shoulder and lifted it up so it would tilt the airplane toward the tail, and that let all the excess fuel that was laying back there and that exhaust system run out on the ground. And after he drained it out, why, then tried it over again. It fired up that time fine. Of course, you call the tower and taxi instructions, taxi out the end of the runway, and on the taxiway, just off the taxiway at the end of the runway, the active runway, was a Jeep with a little glass enclosed section on top of it that was a runway control tower, a little miniature control tower, and he had a radio in there, and he gave you permission to take the runway, and I taxied out the runway and went down to the end of the runway and turned it around. I wanted to get all that runway I could get to take off on, and you run it up to 100% power and check everything and make sure it's burning in the right places and the fuel pressure was okay, and release the brakes and ease it back to 95%, and then ease the brakes, and well, when you release the brakes, it had immediate torque. Wasn't like a P-51, took time for that prop to wind up. It nailed you back against the seat. And just, that thing just straight down the runway, and at about 95 indicated, rotate, get the nose gear off the ground, just barely off the ground. And in that attitude, it just flew itself on off. And of course, it's a good thing there wasn't anybody in my way, because I wouldn't have seen them. I was flying the instruments because I didn't know how else to do that thing. And by the time I got the flaps up and the gear up and pushed my goggles back and wiped the sweat off my forehead and looked at the altimeter, it said 12,000 feet, and I was still going up 6,000 feet a minute. But it was an easy airplane to fly, and we flew it solo the first time, of course, and a time or two after that, and then you flew with an instructor pilot and another airplane, and flew formation with him, and all those different things, and one time we had an air show, and we were coming across that field for some general or something in formation, and boy, we hit extreme turbulence, and man, I mean, that airplane just bounced all over the place. I mean, and it was hard to fly formation with that thing bouncing around. And it's like you were driving a car on those brick streets in downtown Park Avenue. It was really just bounce, bounce, bounce all over the place. And of course, that was kind of unusual air conditions to fly through, but we flew on through it anyway. And this airplane had under the fuselage about midway or a little bit forward of midway of the wing section was what they called dive brakes, and it was two flaps that just, when you put the dive brakes down, they just went down under the fuselage like that, and actually it was supposed to slow you down. Well, that's one pilot, and also we're not supposed to take it through the sound barrier. It wasn't designed to go through the barrier, and so 750 miles an hour was about as fast as you could fly or dive that thing before you started through the barrier, and at 750 or a little bit more indicated why the wings tips would start to buzz. I approached it several times to see what it was like, and looked out the end of the wings, and the wings looked like they were 3 feet thick because they were vibrating so fast. And of course you immediately slowed it down because you didn't want to go through the sound barrier, which was really around 750 miles an hour. And one of the pilots got into that and got excited and put the dive brakes down. And that's the wrong thing to do, because when you put those dive brakes down, it brings the nose up. And he come back into land. It's a wonder he didn't pull the wings off of it, but he come back into land and had to go around. And he was too high or too low, and he had to go around and make another approach and land. And the instructors take us out to that airplane, show us, and the wings from the root of the wings from the fuselage out, halfway the wings, it looked like corrugated roofing. It was so wrinkled from being overstressed. And the fuselage back of the cockpit, a little bit back of the cockpit, was the tail section, and it was bolted on with like 5 bolts that held it on to the rest of it. And this part of the tail section covered the exhaust system of the engine and all that. Right at where the engine was, and covered the exhaust system all. And 3 of those 5 bolts were sheared because of the pressure it was put on. And it's a wonder that plane held together. And the intent in showing you that and telling you about it was that just don't do this. Now, before we went up for the first flight in that airplane, we were supposed to get one ride in what they call the captive air. And out on the far side of the airport, they had an area set there up there with a little concrete blockhouse for a control house, and then they had a concrete pad parking spot. But on the parking spot, they had 2 concrete block walls, and they had the holes in the walls where they had mounted the wings of the airplane back about 1/3 of the way from the tips in the walls that held the airplane up, so when they put the gear down, it would just clear the runway about 2 or 3 inches. And you actually could start the engine and fly the airplane just like a link trainer, and it all could be seen what you were doing on the instruments and all. And the instructor was inside the blockhouse with a control panel in there, and radio could talk to you and everything in the airplane. Actually, it was probably not a radio; it was a intercom system. And went out this one afternoon, and instructor explained it all to us, and of course we hadn't flown then, and asked who wanted to fly it first, and I tried to get to fly it first, but somebody else in front of me had his hand up, and he got to fly it, and then he flew it, and it take off with the flaps down, and put and the wheels down. You rotated, put the wheels up and the flaps up. The airplane never left the concrete walls that the wings were in, but same as, you know. And that was quite a engineering feat, I think, that they had there to be able to make that airplane. This was a flyable airplane that they had. Yeah. But that was all for that day. And so I was going to be first the next afternoon, but the morning group of students went out there, and when they started up, it caught on fire, and nobody else got to fly it. So I didn't get to fly the captive air, and I was real disappointed. But then going on and flying it, it was really a smooth airplane to fly, and it was so much different from the P-51 prop fighter I'd been flying. And then I went back to Wright Field and got assigned to the Communications Navigation Lab, and flying. By now it changed from P for pursuit to F for fighter, and they called them F-80s then. And I was flying F-80s for the Communication Navigation Lab, testing new equipment, new navigation and communication equipment. And one piece of equipment that I was flew checks on a lot was the pilot emergency locator. When a pilot bailed out, if he had this little locator radio with him, when he'd turn it on, it would send a signal out to locate him. And the antenna for locating it was in the fin of the airplane, one on each side of the fin, just mounted flush in the fin. And when they'd take the radio out with a pickup truck, the engineers would, and hide in the woods someplace out from Wright Field there in Ohio, and then you'd go up and fly around and turn your radio on for that check, that part of it. And when you were flying directly toward it, it would give you a solid tone. If you were going to one side, it would give you an A in Morse code. The other side would give you a B. You turn back and get solid tone. You fly right on in. When you got past him, why it gave a different signal, and you know it. And that way, it told you that the radio on the ground was working, and so forth. And there, why also we had other tests that was going on in the Communication Navigation Lab, and one of them was the air-to-air refueling preliminary tests. And I flew in B-29s with another pilot locating the tanker airplane that you would have to locate on instruments, in clouds and instrument conditions. And another test that I flew quite a bit was flown in C-47 transports, and this was a runway landing system, a German runway landing system that lined you up with the runway on instruments in weather, where you could line up and come down to almost a touchdown with their system of radio beacons, beams out from the runway. And then next thing, I had orders to send me to headquarters, 5th Air Force, Japan, as a jet fighter pilot, transferring me to San Francisco, California, to be shipped over to Japan. And just before this happened, we were sent down to Fort Knox, Lexington, Kentucky, and went through a qualification, interrogation, and program and tests and so forth to see if you would get a permanent commission. I had what they called an AUS commission, and this was a temporary commission. And when come back from that, I got a letter from President Harry Truman, and many others got the same letter and said, you qualify, but there's just not room enough. There's not enough spots to commission officers. And about this time I got that transfer letter, and I hadn't signed everything that I had to sign for them to keep me in for another 2 or 3 years, and so I refused to. I told him I wanted out. I was unhappy about it, and I wanted out. And the lieutenant in the administrative section told me, he said, "Well, you've agreed to sign to extend your tour of duty," and I said, "I know that, but I haven't signed the final agreement." And he said, "Well, an officer's word is his bond, and this is action unbecoming of an officer," and so forth and so forth. I said, "I'm sorry about that. You got to let me out." And he got real unhappy about it, and I thought he would put a letter in my file that I'd never get another promotion. Well, they discharged me, and I was the first lieutenant then. They discharged me. On discharge, I got promoted to captain, and then we moved back to Jacksonville, and then to Daytona. I got a job with Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in the warehouse in Jacksonville. Then we moved to Daytona, and I was a field man for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, contacting their dealers in about 7 counties across Central Florida from Daytona to the West Coast. And in Jacksonville, I wanted to join the Air National Guard because they were flying P-80s. But before I got out and flying in the Communication and Navigation Laboratory, there was another pilot flying tests in those P-80s, but he hadn't been to the jet fighter school. He got checked out some way without going to the jet fighter school. And he was flying a early model photo recon model of a P-80 on test flights, and it didn't have a large aileron hydraulic boost control system, and we knew that when you put the gear down, we'd been told in that particular airplane, when you put the gear down, you might have an aileron lock where you couldn't control the stick to level the airplane out. And if the wing went down, and instead of putting the stick in the opposite direction to bring the wing up, you had to pop the stick into that and to release the lock on the system, and then you could bring it back up. Well, he didn't want to talk about all these emergency systems and all in the office, but that happened to him on approach to the airport after he had one tip tank, one wing tank. They were mounted on the tips of the wings then, not under the wing like a P-51. Feed and the other one not feed, and he decided not to drop the tanks. He thought he could land the airplane okay with one tank full and one not. He should have gone and dropped the tanks, either in the middle of the field or out in one of the big lakes there near the field that they told him he could drop the tanks in, but he come in anyway, and with that one tank full, when he turned, he put the gear down, he had an aileron lock, and that tank on that side, of course, pulled the wing down on that side, and instead of popping the hydraulic system to that side to unlock it, well, he fought it, and he just turned over and went straight in. And he and his wife and me and Marion, we, like we did in Texas, we went to each other's house and had dinner and went places together and like that. And Marion was real upset when that happened because it was on TV, and she didn't know if it was me or not, just one of the airplanes.
So he crashed with the plane.
Yeah, he died with the plane, and he was from Denver, Colorado, and we took his body back out to Denver over the Air Force transport and had a funeral for him and everything, met his family and all. And as I recall, his last name was also Griffin. And anyway, so Marion didn't want me to join the Air National Guard because of that. She didn't want me to fly anymore. And so we left there and went to Daytona Beach with Goodyear, and I went out to the airport there and went to Air Reserve meetings, and it was just instructional meetings and ground school and that sort of thing, no flying. And then we moved to Orlando, and they were setting up a troop carrier squadron and reserve pilots. And I went to the old Army Air Base here, which was now the Naval Training Center, later turned out to be the Naval Training Center. And the guys sitting there at the desk talking to people that wanted to get in this troop carrier squadron as pilots turned out to be one of the master sergeants, or both of the master sergeants that was in the Daytona Beach reserve outfit, where I went and I knew them real well, friends with them. And he said, well, hi, Ben, you here, you want to get in this outfit? And I said, sure, that's why I'm here. And he said, well, we're pretty full up. Let me see here. And he said, let's see, you're a captain, aren't you? And I said, yeah. He took his list and he looked down the list and says, here's a good spot for you right here. Crossed out the name, wrote my name in on top of it. And so that's that's how I got assigned to the 78th Troop Carrier Squadron at the Orlando Municipal Airport on Colonial Drive, right here in Orlando, and out on the west side of the airport, where they had a big hangar and a little building they had headquarters in, and we had C-46 Curtiss transport planes. They were about like a DC-3 C-47, but instead of the windshield being square down, it was a cigar-shaped, fared right into the fuselage in the nose part, and smooth. And we flew those, and we did all kind of things, like we hauled equipment downrange when he was setting up the rocket firing ranges for Cape Canaveral, and we hauled paratroopers out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky for their training drops, and we hauled cargo out to the fighter gunnery meets out in Arizona, and a number of different things, until finally we changed out of those C-46s to C-119 flying boxcars. And this was the twin engine still, but it was a big fuselage with twin booms going back to the tail. And there was some talk in the past about how those things wouldn't fly very good on one engine, but I found out with the instructor that you could feather one engine, that thing fly along just fine, and you can even land it on one engine. But then shortly after that, Senator Strom Thurmond from Carolina got the 78th Troop Carrier Squadron transferred to Carolina, and that closed out the 78th Troop Carrier Squadron. By now, I was promoted to major, and then I was promoted on to lieutenant colonel, and that's where I retired as lieutenant colonel. And in 1969, I was in Jacksonville, and I took the papers with me, applying to be placed on retirement, to the post office in Jacksonville, the same post office where I signed up to join the Air Force. And so that about ended it, except that then the Navy took over the Air Force base, and before I signed off to be retired completely, took over the Air Force base, and well, no, I was retired. And then they had a Navy flying club, and any retired military pilot could join the Navy flying club and fly the airplanes that the club owned. And they owned Cessnas and 172s and 152s, and they owned another Cessna, a little larger Cessna, and then they got a Piper retract gear. All these Cessnas were fixed gear. And when I first flew that Cessna, this was the first time I'd really flown a civilian airplane. And that thing felt like it was a fallen leaf to me. It didn't feel like it was a real airplane. It just seemed like it floated along, and when you come into land, it felt like it was falling, but it finally got to where that it didn't feel that way, and I had no problem with that. And then one time, we took one of the Cessnas down to Sarasota, and an instructor pilot went with me, and his wife and Marion went with me, and we went down to Sarasota and landed at that airport where I flew P-40s. And Woody met us, and Marion went with him to the Longboat Key to stay at his place, and I was going to drive down later because I couldn't get off then, and this was at night, and we flew over Disney, and by the time you got a little past Disney, the lights of Disney, you could see the lights down at Lakeland and on down, and it was a real smooth flight. We had to wait for the thunderstorms to go by before we take off. We took off at night, and she sat in the back seat with the pilot's wife, and that's the only time Marion ever flew with me. and
didn't like flying too much, huh?
Of course, we could go out and flew those airplanes anytime we wanted to, the Navy Flying Club. And before the Navy Flying Club closed down, well, we had we got a Navion, and I checked out in that, and that was North American's civilian P-51 after World War II, and it was a real nice airplane, and it's a sort of a more or less, I guess, an antique now, but they still Navions are flying, and then we got a T-34 Navy trainer, a single engine. Canopy, sliding canopy, tandem seat, Navy trainer, and I flew that, and Kevin went up in that with me a time or two. The first time we went up, I had forgotten to get any barf bags, and he got sick in that back cockpit, and man, I mean, it was a mess. But and he was so embarrassed, poor guy, and he.
Kevin will love to hear this.
And anyway, I took him on home and come back, and I cleaned it all up and everything. And then Kevin was eligible also to get flight instructions from the club because he wasn't 18 or 21 or whatever it was. He wasn't 18 yet, so he was eligible to get flight instruction, and he got several hours of flight instruction with the Navy Flying Club.
Oh, yeah.
And he and I flew a number of other times together. That was the only time that he had any problem at all. And he did real good. He never soloed, but he did real good. He could have gone on and soloed, but then time went by and he was past the age where he was eligible to fly as a member's family for flight instruction. And one time when I was flying in that club, Gary flew with me, and we had a single engine low wing plane then, and we got up in the airplane and looked around, and Gary said, "Golly," he said, "I never realized you can see everything from up here." I said, "Yeah, you like it okay?" And so when I took someone like that up, I was always careful not to make steep turns or do any slow rolls or do any figure eights or any other maneuvers that might get them upset, you know. And I didn't do that with Kevin that time either. We flew out to Claremont and then made a turn and over the Citrus Tower out there and flew back here. And the turn over the Citrus